Hi, it's Paul. Let's look at adenocarcinoma and the features that it expresses in cytology specimens. We'll look at examples from lymph node, but most of these features are applicable to metastatic adenocarcinomas in any site, pretty much in cytology. So this is the most common metastasis seen in cytologic specimens, as well as being the primary tumour of many sites. We'll look at the usual features, starting with arrangement. And the classic arrangement of adenocarcinomas are cohesive groups, and they vary from three-dimensional balls to acini or microacini rosettes, crowded honeycomb type sheets. And in addition, another feature that's characteristic is mucin, either in vacuoles in the cells or even in the background when there's a well-differentiated tumour. Here's an example, and you can see even at low power on this specimen that has a lot of blood in it, that there are cohesive groups of epithelial cells. And so we're dealing most likely with a adenocarcinoma or some other type of carcinoma. You can see there's some little groups, and these are background lymphocytes, the single cells mostly. But most of the epithelial cells, the tumour cells, are looking quite cohesive. This is another area of the slide, and you can see they're forming these balls of cells that seem organised and quite cohesive, so they're holding together. Often you'll see them like this. These are very glandular looking arrangements with nuclei arranged around the outside of the group and a reasonable amount of cytoplasm. A few more examples. This one on higher power, you can see even has a cytoplasmic vacuole on the bottom there. And notice how the nuclei are mostly arranged around the outside of this group. And that really just reflects the fact that these are columnar cells, and that is a feature that persists even in adenocarcinoma. This one's showing a ball of cells. It's fairly three-dimensional, and here you can see some more groups of these cells. They have cytoplasmic vacuolation, that's the clearing. They have like almost a community border around the outside of the cells and the nuclei are arranged in tight little clusters. Just an example on the PAP of another group, and you can see there can be quite a bit of depth of focus on focusing up and down through this group, and you can see it's several layers deep, and that's characteristic of adenocarcinoma sort of balls sometimes. This is a classic glandular arrangement in a diff-quick stain slide. See how the nuclei are pretty much arranged around the outside of this group, and it has a scalloped but fairly smooth community border. This one much the same. In fact, even a better example. You can see the columnar shape to the cells with the nucleus out on the edge. And these are classic rosettes or microacini that are typical of adenocarcinoma. Notice how the nuclei are all peripheral here, and then the apical edge of the cell is pointing into what would have been maybe a lumen. So the cells are trying to form a gland still. This is just an example of a massive overproduction of mucin that some well-differentiated adenocarcinomas produce, and you get a background heavily laden with mucin. We will now have a look at cytoplasm. So most adenocarcinomas have a fair amount of cytoplasm, and it's usually vacuolated in some fashion, so that might be just granular, as in small foamy vacuoles, or they might be large, hard-edged, secretory type vacuoles. Often, but not always, this is mucin, and so mucin stains can be helpful sometimes. And the cells generally show that real columnar shape, even though they're malignant, or maybe a cuboidal shape if they're more from a sort of a ductal type adenocarcinoma. Another example with some groups of cells These ones are showing quite fine vacuolation on the diff quick stain. You can see just little punched out clearings in the cytoplasm. And so this is more what I would call sort of punctate vacuoles, more cells. Notice here you can see the columnar shape to the cells as well. So that small little group, you can see the long polarized nuclei and the long tails of cytoplasm on these. This is an example of vacuolation, and these are called targetoid vacuoles, or some people call them intracytoplasmic lumens. So these are punched out round vacuoles, often seen in well differentiated adenocarcinomas, and they have a small blob of material inside the vacuole, forming like a target shape. And you can see them here. These are little, fairly uniform, as you expect for well differentiated tumour cells, and they have these little targetoid vacuoles in them. This can be a useful feature to identify that this is an adenocarcinoma and not something else that would produce a plasmacytoid cell. This group here is like a sort of crowded sheet of cells. There's little nucleoli in all of these, but again, notice little hard-edged vacuoles in various places in here. And as I was saying, this can be helpful in separating glandular tumours from other lookalikes, maybe like melanoma. Just moving around, you can see a few more vacuoles, nice little hard edge. So once you see one, you can see quite a lot, but you need to keep your eye out for them. And always think about, what this could be. What do I need to see to identify that it's adenocarcinoma? Let's look at nuclei. So in adenocarcinoma cells, these are usually eccentric, so polarized to the basal end of the cell. They show variable anisokaryosis, so that obviously depends on the differentiation or the grade of the tumour. Low-grade tumours that are well differentiated will show a small amount of anisokaryosis, whereas less differentiated tumours, high-grade, will show quite variable size and shape of nuclei. Generally speaking, adenocarcinomas have nice round or oval nuclei that have quite smooth nuclear membranes, so they don't tend to be very indented a lot. They certainly don't tend to be spindled either. And compared to squamous cell carcinomas, the chromatin's often quite fine, so it's not that really coarse, super hyperchromatic appearance that you see with squamous cell carcinomas. And the really definitive feature often of adenocarcinomas is that very prominent single central macronucleolus. Here's a good example, single central nucleolus. They also have chromatin that's maybe a little coarse, but it's generally speaking quite fine. As you can see here, the nuclei are still pretty round. They're varying in size, but most of them are fairly round or oval in shape. Chromatin's looking a little irregularly distributed in especially the top two nuclei there, but it is still fairly fine compared to SCC. Here's a higher grade tumour, and you can see massive variation in size and shape in these, very prominent single central nucleoli, but in this case still fairly fine chromatin in the nuclei. Just one further example, you can see in this one again, chromatin maybe a little coarser in these. They're certainly very hyperchromatic and they're varying quite a bit, but again it's a kind of uniformity to the shape of the nuclei. So once you've made a diagnosis of adenocarcinoma, of course you always have to stop and consider what else could this be. Metastatic melanoma. It can be plasmacytoid, it can be fairly uniform, often has prominent single central nucleoli, and adenocarcinoma can have that quite dispersed pattern as well. So it's important to look for adenocarcinoma features such as cohesion, vacuolation and mucin, columnar cell shapes, and and look for the absence of melanoma features. Another common diagnosis when it's a poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma is with a poorly differentiated squamous cell